Oh hi, I'm the heretic.
Something which I haven't really done too often on this channel is responses to articles which make ridiculous arguments in regards to ethics, economics, and general political application or research. As a matter of fact, it's been quite a while since I've just made a plain response video altogether, and I know that this is something people have been asking about for quite some time. Well, Filthy and I have quite the treat for you all today. It's an article hosted on a board with the hilariously crude and sure of itself title, Non-Libertarian FAQ, as if this was the nail in the coffin and sure to be the final piece of literature ever needing to be written regarding the debate in question. And I think it's safe to say that we've come across the most autistic article and political author, I think, who's ever attempted to step into the libertarian versus statism debate.
Is it more autistic than that professor who made governmentisgood.com?
Actually, that would be a good place to start in describing the content of this FAQ, as the author proclaims it to be. For those of you who didn't see, about a year ago now, I covered a video which was created by the author of a website entitled governmentisgood.com, summarizing the content hosted on his webpage. And in this response video, I briefly took a glance at the webpage, which consisted of attempted rebuttals to ethical and pragmatic arguments from anti-state and state-skeptical political and philosophical positions. Most of his replies, as many of you might expect, consisted of non sequiturs and nonsensical attempts to dodge questions which he himself proposed and attempted to provide a rebuttal to. And one of the very things you'll notice right off the bat when you actually get to the articles is the striking similarities in how both the author of this blog post, Mike Hubin, and the author of governmentisgood.com, Douglas J. Amy, argue for their positions and attempt to refute counter-arguments. You know, the complete lack of self-awareness, unironically proposing what at this point for decades, sometimes even centuries, have been old chestnuts bordering on meme territory in some circumstances, such as the Rhodes argument. But what makes Hubin stand apart, as briefly touched upon before, is that unlike Amy, Hubin very evidently has an inflated ego and perceives these arguments, as well as his cognitive ability, to be more profound than they actually are. For example, in the About section, in an attempt to present authoritative qualifications for why you should definitely listen to him, which he really didn't have to do, given that if someone were to criticize his arguments based on his lack of qualifications, that would be fallacious reasoning. But he lists, quote, having 20 years of experience in debate over electronic networks. Much of that has been with religious believers and creationists, and this colors some of the arguments and examples. So basically, I debated people on r/atheism for most of my adult life, and I'm a master debater, so watch out, creationists and libtards, cause you're just like the other fundamentalists I've crushed with my Rick and Morty IQ rationalism. Oh shit. Watch out, Murray Rothbard, with your PhD in business from Columbia University, or Lysander Spooner with your apprenticeship under famous historical legal philosopher John Davis. We got a big boy fedora tipping redditor who remembers the civics that were beaten into his head through government education and is euphoric in his memory of Tom Hartman broadcasts. And we'll of course be going over numerous examples of this throughout the video in regards to the substance of his arguments, but it's interesting to note how he frames libertarians through his internal worldview and how he frames his position in contrast with that of the libertarian position he's attempting to provide a rebuttal for. Like, throughout this FAQ, for instance, a running theme which you'll find is that he consistently attempts to make the equivalence between libertarians arguing against political authority and religious fundamentalists arguing for creationism in an attempt to assert that libertarianism is sort of a secular religious philosophy, I guess, which is just an ad hominem. It's also pretty fucking hilarious for reasons we'll be going over in a bit. He also, on his Patreon page for the website which he tried to start, which obviously didn't work out, given that the most recent post was from January of 2015, promotes their ridiculous claims that political elites promote libertarianism as part of their agenda. McCoke brothers promote conservative think tanks, and conservatism is the same thing as libertarianism, because I broadly define libertarianism to where this wouldn't be inconsistent, and resorts to class rhetoric to justify his stance against libertarianism, trying to paint libertarians as ultra-rich or the 1%. Again, this'll be pretty funny later on. Also, one last thing before we start, I just love to point out how, despite the fact that his most recent post on Patreon was from 2015, and his attempted wiki being deader than disco from what I can see, he still has patrons giving him money every month. This means that there are a handful of people who have enough money to just blindly spend it, and not even care what they're spending it on, who are giving it to him for his project. Yet he's trying to frame the people his wiki and book would be dedicated to attacking as rich bourgeoisie 1%ers. I don't know, I just thought it was kind of funny and worth pointing out.
The original intent of the founders has been perverted.
This is the first point in this FAQ, so this must mean that it's the most common argument. Certainly the most common argument that this author has encountered, or at least one he considers most relevant to debunking libertarianism, which is just disappointing, because no principled libertarian would unironically argue this. Yeah, I know, no true Scotsman, but if we define libertarianism as the rejection of political authority, then a libertarian citing a document authorizing political authority makes as much sense as a Marxist citing Barry Goldwater for their economic arguments. The first point, and it's already a straw man argument. Maybe if he were speaking to conservatives, constitutionalists, or just generally Republican voters, he might have had a point. But libertarians don't recognize any political rule as legitimate. At all. I don't care if the founders' intentions were perverted or not. Any libertarian who unironically argues for libertarianism on the basis of the US Constitution isn't a libertarian. They're a statist, trying to co-opt and dilute the meaning of the term. Now I can give him the benefit of the doubt, because Hoppians and the Libertarian Party exist, trying to co-opt a state-skeptical philosophy in favor of what is essentially liberalism. So there is some confusion as to what a libertarian is. That's understandable. But it should be telling for what the rest of this article is going to be like if the best I can say about the guy in his first point is that he's ignorant. The alternative is that he's a liar.
The US government ignores the plain meaning of the Constitution.
Yeah, at this point, if you haven't figured out, the author here seems to be under the impression that Enlightenment liberalism is a school of libertarian thought, or vice versa, which, you know, that's a really bad sign of what's to come when the first couple of points, this FAQ dedicated to debunking libertarianism once and for all, aren't actually even related to libertarian philosophy or its political application. In fact, it seems to confirm the point that I had established earlier about Hubin being an emotionally invested pseudo-intellectual whose objection to what he perceives to be libertarianism is not based fundamentally upon disagreement with the philosophical base libertarians have for their beliefs, or a dispute with the observation libertarians make, but rather he perceives his relative conception of libertarianism to be opposed to his own personal interests and engages in cognitive dissonance in order to avoid both having his own worldview challenged and to avoid being confronted with information that to him, acknowledging would jeopardize his own interests. And in a state society, thanks to centralized economic policy using force to socially engineer human behavior in a way which disadvantages people of certain marginal preferences for the perceived benefit of other marginal preferences, people view their own personal material interests interchangeably with philosophy and observations about nature, which would right off the bat explain the spiteful nature of these responses and the prevalence of the Dunning-Kruger effect in this article. Now, to briefly explain the difference between liberalism and libertarianism, both in philosophy and political application, liberalism is an umbrella term which refers to a varying degree of political positions, and as such doesn't have any defining principles other than materialism. That's why people ranging from pseudo-natural law theorists such as John Locke all the way to utilitarians or absolute monarchists such as John Stuart Mill or Thomas Hobbes respectively can have their ideas fit under the category of liberal thought. And liberalism's political application is a critique of the mercantilist economic model which emerged in response to the unsustainable debt which governments operating around this model incurred due to mismanagement of resources inherent to a mercantilist economy, coupled with the artificial scarcity which it created. And in attempt to fix the collapsing socio-political order most governments of the world were undergoing at the time, with concepts such as the social contract or quote-unquote representative government in response to various innovations coming into existence which allowed for more scientific methodologies to be proposed and expanded upon, but more importantly allowed for more people to spread more information, and as a result more conceptions came into prominence regarding various different ecclesiastical conceptions of Christianity, which incidentally destroyed the master narrative which states for the last 1500 years up until this point had used to try and justify their existence and how they operate in the interests of the non-state actors they ruled over, which was that God appointed the monarchy, God's will was in the interests of the population, therefore the population's interests were to be ruled by the monarchy. Well, now there were dozens of different ideas for what God's will were, so naturally this led to a lot of unrest, and the political rulers had to invent a new master narrative in order to establish the framework of states functioning in the interests of non-state actors. Libertarianism, on the other hand, in principle is a metaphysical philosophy asserting that all moral agents have dominion over their own actions, bodies, and the products of their own actions. Applied to politics, libertarianism, as a result of its core philosophy, is the world's only anti-political allegiance, meaning that it rejects all political rule on the grounds that political rule doesn't have the ability to justify itself, as the premise of political rule rests upon a series of undemonstrable claims, or claims which are in fact impossible to demonstrate because the reasoning they operate around is internally inconsistent, e.g., you can demonstrate dominion over another moral agent which already has dominion over themselves, or that someone who's aggressing upon another person has recourse in arguing that the person they're aggressing upon doesn't have a rightful claim to retaliate. Libertarianism, in turn, doesn't propose a central policy plan for how people can or can't associate, or which attempts to socially engineer their behavior, because libertarianism works as an attempt to counter political rule in all forms. And since the core to all political rule is the monopoly on arbitration, a libertarian society does not have a monopoly on arbitration. Now, as for Hubin's criticism of constitutionalism, it could be worse, and I don't have any real objections to the specific argument which he made, other than posting this under a section of criticisms directed at libertarianism, and also I'd expand upon it a little bit. It's not really that the signers of the Constitution didn't make their positions clear, because they did. It's more that because every single person has a different relative framework of how they conceptualize the world around their interests, and the narrative structures through which their framework is built causes people to contextualize information differently from one another. So I would argue not that the signers of the US Constitution, or any other constitution for that matter, didn't make their philosophy or intent clear. It's that no matter what degree of clarity any group writing any constitution could provide, they will never be able to convey a founding philosophy which is 100% 100% free of controversy because there's no objective conceptualization of how information is conveyed. On top of this, because of the previously noted issue where states have a socially dysgenic effect on society caused by the mere existence of a monopolization on arbitration and centralized economic policy, it's made increasingly likely that people will construct increasingly varied interpretations of the Constitution over time in order to protect their perceived material interests. Personally, I would have approached this with the much stronger and more effective criticism that because there's no explicit agreement which exists between each individual person and the state, even in principle, there's no obligation on the part of the state to serve the interests of each individual person. That's not even to mention how states are fundamentally incapable of serving the interests of every person, because as noted earlier, and because states are incapable of producing their own resources, they rely on a coercive appropriation of privately produced resources, and given that states can't give people rights which they don't already have, since rights exist as a result of moral agency, which is an inherent characteristic of all people, this means that states can at best, even in principle, only provide material resources, meaning that anything the state provides must come at another group's expense. And I think we all know who that group is. Or you know that because states require exponential growth and operate around coercion to exist, have a direct structural incentive to function antagonistically towards the interests of people who are not state actors. So unless the principle behind your political messaging is the state needs whatever is currently beneficial to the state at any given time, which is always going to be against my and everyone else's interests, then you will never have your interests met, and none of your perceived problems with society will ever be resolved by the state. And that's the best case scenario, which is unrealistic because it doesn't take into account the previously noted fact that states operate around exponential growth because they require increasingly more resources to spend, and states require more spending as they become increasingly involved in global politics. In reality, the outcome will be much worse. These minarchy types can't even fall back on the weakest and most uncompelling argument in favor of the state, which is, our state will be benevolent this time. All states require commerce because they need taxable resources, but economic growth means new forms of trade, which requires more government services to be able to monitor and tax it, which, as a result, will have the state expand exponentially. The only way states could even attempt to work around this structural problem would be to restrict trade so much that it would utterly impoverish society, in turn defeating the purpose, since you would need a hellish 1984-esque Orwellian dystopia to ensure that your small government remains small. Continuous and persistent propaganda would be the only way you might be able to have people see such a state as functioning in their interests. But as we've seen in global depressions, or when states of the past have become too expansive, people will just form counter-economies to subvert the state in favor of their own interests. And even then, such a government, as I described previously, would still demand exponential growth to fund the restrictions upon and plundering of their economy. It's pretty ironic, really. States require commerce to produce taxable resources, but commerce is what kills states. It's really funny that the go-to argument from statists against libertarians is to argue from pragmatism when any state has such glaring structural defects. But we know why statists continue to support the state, and we know why Hubin would never use these criticisms, because these criticisms would require Hubin and statists like him to reject the state altogether and to acknowledge inherent flaws with the socio-political order he's claiming operates around the interests of himself along with everyone else. So it's understandable why he would stick to the weakest and most milquetoast of uncompelling arguments.
The Declaration of Independence says,
We've got the same problem as before. A philosophy allegedly citing documents of state rule as evidence against the legitimacy of state rule. In the context of the Declaration, colonial America severed all political ties with Great Britain. Now I can envision some contexts where libertarians would cite the Declaration, like comparing the grievances the authors had with the British government to modern US government tyrannization. But the Declaration does not endorse voluntary association. Arguing against it to go after libertarians is a straw man argument. I wonder if this will become a trend.
Libertarians are defenders of freedom and rights.
Now, this one is just bizarre because this isn't a claim which, to my knowledge, has been made by anyone, statist or libertarian alike. And the libertarian position on what preserves each individual's rights is the individual themselves and their own actions, or the associations which they establish with other individuals. I.e. paying your neighbor with a gun to watch your house, or establishing arbitration with a third party if a dispute were to occur. So, it would be very bizarre if this actually was something which a libertarian did say, and given the arguments which Hubin made under this point, odds are it's not something he's ever seen or heard. Rather, he just had a bunch of cliche statist talking points he felt like he had to impulsively ramble off about and get out of his system, that for some reason he thinks libertarians have no answer to, despite these being some of the most overused and long debunked rebuttals libertarians have been responding to practically since Spooner was around. Which is especially funny, seeing as this is intended to be a comprehensive rebuttal to libertarian arguments, which, as prefaced in the introduction, are supposed to be a bunch of empty rhetorical non-arguments built on quasi-religious tautology, only appearing to stand up to scrutiny because no one's properly refuted them, and consequently most people would be unprepared to respond. Well, why the fuck, then, is the author not only apparently unable to provide original arguments like he promised, but also arguably engaging in the same argumentative tactics which he claims libertarians are? Is it possible that maybe, just maybe, that his characterization of libertarianism is actually Freudian projection? Well, anyway, on to the arguments presented here. First point, the government defends your rights. No. Already went over both how this is laughably untrue in response to the second section listed on this FAQ, and in explaining the actual libertarian proposition at the beginning of this point. But yes, it does in fact appear that Hubin calling libertarianism a religious philosophy is projection, because Hubin is apparently laboring under the delusion that politicians have supernatural powers. Specifically, they have the ability to engage in actions and establish abilities for themselves or others which can't naturally be demonstrated or shown by anything else, because in order to argue that only the government can provide a certain service or establish a right, that's what you'd have to effectively argue. Unless you can actually establish a provable, characteristic, or demonstrable difference which makes state actors fundamentally different from any other moral agent or any other living being on Earth, which, spoiler alert, Hubin does not attempt to do, and no statist throughout all of history has been able to consistently provide an explanation of how this would be the case. He then goes on immediately afterwards to say that libertarians have a worldview which is divorced from any sort of practical observation, which at this point many people, particularly other libertarians who may be reading this without any prior information about Hubin, may be starting to think that this is parody, because the irony of that statement is so powerful that he just must, at the very least, somewhat be aware that what he's saying is ridiculous. But no, this is just a case of Poe's law. I don't know why these utility arguments are so common among statists, because even within the statist framework of how their interests are conceived of, it's really stupid. Every single service which he mentioned is a high-demand service, and as a result will exist whether or not the state is around. In fact, there would be more of these services available with more competition among them without the state intervening in the market and creating creating artificial scarcity. This also plays into another assertion Cuban and high time preference statists like him seem to start from as a foundational premise of their worldview, which is completely disassociated from observable reality, and most people, including Cuban, would probably vehemently disagree with if faced with these arguments attached to a different subject. This being that not only is it possible for people to not be self-interested even slightly, but that the only people who exist that aren't self-interested are the people who, as part of their job, require subordinating you for the sake of subordinating you and taking your resources against your will. Because even assuming social contract theory was valid, or that consent could be unilateral without the active participation of the second party, since state services are not dependent on active consent and the state uses force to take your resources rather than trade in mutually beneficial associations, what incentive does the state have to function in your interests? There's no competition because you're forced to associate with it, and in many cases the state will actually suppress competitors. So why on earth are they going to take your interests into consideration? They don't need your say to make their ends meet. In fact, because the state doesn't need you or anyone else to benefit in order for them to benefit, that actually carries a rather sinister implication, which is that in fact the state meets its interests by directly antagonizing the interests of people who aren't state actors, which is why government schools brainwash children into being unquestioning of authority figures and into the narrative that the state exists to serve their interests, why governments with nationalized healthcare services such as the UK's NHS kill people to save revenue or simply refuse to serve people if they have certain health conditions, why police kill people or make up arbitrary excuses to arrest them or otherwise extort money from them, and why the military, along with the various intelligence agencies, are being used as enforcement organizations for various international state-sponsored cartels, such as OPEC, to kill people and use force against other governments and organizations which act in ways they perceive to be a challenge to their interests, rather than prepare children for the world and how they can best assess their own interests, provide services to sick or injured people, and actually protect people from criminals like the state claims that they do, or how these services would actually function in a libertarian society. Also, not to mention that the third point proposes a circular argument, which is that something can't be true or functional because it hasn't ever been shown anywhere in the past. This claim is also entirely ahistorical, as there are various stateless societies which have existed throughout all of history, i.e. neutral Morsnet, Kospaya, the Kapaku Papuans of New Guinea, and there are even modern examples of stateless societies such as Chiron, Mexico. And yes, in all of these cases, living standards were and are demonstrably better in comparison to their contrasted authoritarian societies. As for the last paragraph, I find it rather hilarious that he's unironically defending statism with the argument that people should be pissing in the streets and sleeping under bridges, because it really shows the level of desperation we're at, when one of the best defenses the author could think of for the state, one which he feels was so good that it made its way into his definitive rebuttal to libertarianism, is, well, libertarianism is bad because people will actually have an incentive to keep people from pissing and shitting in the streets, and people won't be homeless so people aren't sleeping under bridges, which practically is an endorsement of libertarianism. People having an incentive to maintain the quality of their property and people having access to more resources so there are fewer poor people. In statist argumentation, these are usually problems which are presented to libertarians as examples of things which a libertarian society has no way to get rid of. Yeah, I don't know about you, but any society where the streets are clean enough that you could practically eat off of them and which don't have homeless people sleeping under bridges sounds good to me.
Taxation is theft.
Hey, an actual libertarian argument. Theft is the appropriation of property against the will of its owner. A claim on the property of another is a claim to the labor put in by the original owner in order to produce or trade for said property. When one owns the labor of someone else, That makes them their slave. Now, the owner may trade for, gift, or otherwise voluntarily exchange their property to another, but in the absence of this, well, theft has occurred. This relationship does not change if the thief calls themselves government or calls their theft taxation. As a condition for living somewhere, the state makes a claim on your property, and you must give them an arbitrary amount of it determined by them. Or in the case of the United States and their excise tax laws, if you're born in the United States and you owe them a percentage of your property. The author attempts to refute this by arguing that property is theft. First off, the deflection tactics are transparent. If you want to make a Marxian critique of the concept of property, go ahead. Well, we're talking about taxes here, but just for funsies, I'll play along. Let's assume we accept as valid the concept that property is theft, and that the simple act of holding property is unjust. By appropriating goods and services, it is being stolen from all others who might wish to use it. Okay, so let's use this framework. Taking this framework to its logical conclusion, the only just form of distribution is for all property to be held in common, including by any government. If we accept that property is theft, then taxation must still be theft. The state must exercise dominion over every appropriated resource, making it their property. See the problem yet? The only way to get around this is for the taxed resources to be held in common as well, moving them from the commons to the commons. To be just in a society where property is held in common, taxation cannot occur. If property is just, taxation is theft. If property is unjust, taxation is theft. When your own deflection tactics BTFO your own arguments, ooh, that's embarrassing. Let's be clear though, property in common is not unethical. It might not be desirable, but that's a question of preference. As long as all participants voluntarily consent, it is no concern of mine. But he tries to redeem himself by arguing that taxes are justified under the social contract. Except, I don't know where the social contract is, what it says on it, or even what a social contract is, and he's not going to tell me. I know the creators of social contract theory had differing and mutually exclusive ideas of what a social contract is, so I have no way of knowing that it doesn't just say whatever someone says it means. All I know is that I didn't sign any social contract, nor did I ask for the services I'm allegedly paying for. More importantly, I'd like to know how to opt out of this contract.
If you don't pay your taxes, men with guns will show up at your house, initiate force, and put you in jail.
So, Filthy in the last section went over the general problem with the social contract arguments, or at the very least, the most glaringly obvious problem anyone encounters when actually analyzing the content of this argument right off the bat.
Where is it? You never give it to an ordinary citizen. Where is it?
So, I suppose that I'll go over exactly why it's important for an association between two parties to be voluntary, since the author seems to understand that it's important for boosting the explanatory power of whatever position in an association he's attempting to defend, as evidenced by the fact that he goes through the effort to actually attempt to bullshit his readers into thinking that coercive state actions are voluntary by shifting the burden of proof onto the people who are being aggressed upon and inventing arbitrary standards which don't actually prove anything on the part of the people whom force is being used against by the state, and doesn't just dismiss the arguments on the parts of libertarians altogether, but based on these attempts to explain how coercive actions are consensual, he clearly doesn't understand why it's important. Well, consent is important because it's the only way in which a moral agent is able to provably demonstrate that any association which they engaged in wasn't an act of aggression upon another person, person and vice versa. This is because, as noted in my explanation earlier of what libertarian metaphysics assert, the logical conclusion of moral agency is the absolute dominion over the said moral agent self, their actions, and the products of their actions, this axiom commonly being referred to as self-ownership. Moral agents can't be free of dominion because that's contradicted by the observation of purposeful human action, and it's a logically fallacious position to attempt to declare dominion over another moral agent. Specifically, it would be an argument from special pleading. Another reason aside why I think it's important to establish this is that many statists, particularly because they either don't understand themselves or are desperately trying to pull one over on people because they think that their audience doesn't understand this, as you can see by this attempted rebuttal on Mike Cuban's part, regularly attempt to redefine words and concepts in order to superficially equate them with concepts which they're fundamentally not compatible with, also known as the equivocation fallacy, or will attempt to equate two incompatible concepts and compare them, also known as a false equivalence. And statists are doing this fundamentally when they attempt to appeal to the social contract. This is because it's rarely ever established or written about why exactly consent is so important in the establishment of foundational principles. It's just assumed that it is for most people without them really ever thinking about why and what makes it so important. The suppression of this concept in mainstream discourse, on the other hand, is almost certainly intentional because the establishment of moral agency into the question would undermine the state's narrative which it attempts to build for how it's even legitimate in the first place. This being that consent necessarily has to be an actively asserted position on the part of every party that's involved in the association in question. Otherwise, there's no standard of proof which would hold someone accountable for their part of an agreement, or way to go about falsifying someone claiming that another person consented to an agreement. Could you imagine an insurance company trying to sue some random person on the grounds that they consented to a contract with no contract or proof that the other person had even communicated with the said insurance company? Or someone defending themselves after raping a girl in court unironically claiming that his victim consented because she happened to be on the same street as him, wearing certain clothing that was totally asking for it, because both of these arguments were on the exact same principle behind social contract theory. And not only would I imagine that pretty much any person making arguments for social contract theory would reject these two arguments based on the exact same reasoning they use to defend the state, but both of these things are things which themselves are declared illegitimate excuses if attempted to be argued for in the state's own courts. With this being established, it's really easy to understand why most statists appeal to moral relativism, because social contract theory has so little merit to it, and has been so thoroughly trashed, that if it wasn't for the fact that people from a young age in state societies are brainwashed into believing that their interests are interchangeable with that of the governments through government schools, no one in the 21st century would be unironically making this argument. In fact, I doubt that anyone would have ever sincerely proposed this argument in the first place, given that if you actually read Locke's second treatise of government, his argument for the legitimacy of the social contract was more or less, yeah, it would be impossible for governments to obtain consent, so fuck everyone who doesn't consent, we're just going to ignore them and pretend they did. Paraphrasing, of course, but that's actually his argument. Also, libertarians don't reject force for the very reason which the author lays out here, only the initiation of force, so this is a straw man argument, not to mention that the argument presented here contradicts the argument in the previous point regarding property itself being theft.
Social contract? I never signed no stinking social contract.
Well, no, we didn't. Nor did our parents, as he asserts. Now, parents can make agreements on behalf of their hatchlings, since they usually aren't mentally capable of making informed decisions that the standard of active consent requires. However, once they reach the age of consent, it cannot be legitimately argued that they can be bound to a contract that they, themselves, didn't sign. That's contract fraud. Now it's kind of funny. If we take this argument to its logical conclusion, every natural-born citizen had the social contract signed on their behalf by their parents. That means that literally 0 natural-born Americans have ever signed the social contract for themselves. But just how is a social contract signed? I know for a fact that we are never given a copy, or a pen, or a witness, or any of the things that are required for a signature to be valid. I asked my parents, and they said they never received a social contract for me either, so they didn't sign it. No, the author's threshold of active consent is being in a geographic location. Not going somewhere because that's active. Being somewhere. No reasonable person would call one's geographic location a form of active consent. This is classic shifting of the burden of proof, away from someone making the active claim that I signed a document I was never even presented with. No reputable contract law judge would recognize this as anything except fraudulent. If it were valid, then your driving by a bank's front window is all the consent they need to sign you up for a mortgage. If a bank did that, we'd say that their argument is unfalsifiable and therefore invalid. So why is it suddenly okay when a corporation called the US government does it? He makes a point about the continuation of the so-called social contract or explicit leaving. I'll make a point about leaving later, but we were added into the so-called social contract fraudulently.